Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today I've got another beauty from our orange friend. No, not that one. Arguably about as toxic, but not that one either. That's the one. He's back with more of the same, if I reword what they say in a way that changes the meaning, then I'm right. So let's go!
Just remember, the stuff presented by this creepy bear is from the Evolution 101 website, written by the Understanding Evolution team. Commentary by Rent-A-Friend2000, that's me!
Understanding phylogenies. Understanding a phylogeny is a lot like reading a family tree. The root of the tree represents the ancestral lineage, and the tips of the branches represent the descendants of that ancestor. As you move from the root to the tips, you are moving forward in time.
Well, without a TARDIS? I don't like the sound of that.
No! You can't be a Doctor Who fan! Just remember River Song is on my side.
When a lineage splits, speciation, it is represented as branching on a phylogeny. When a speciation event occurs, a single ancestral lineage gives rise to two or more daughter lineages. Phylogenies trace patterns of shared ancestry between lineages. Each lineage has a part of its history that is unique to it alone and parts that are shared with other lineages. Similarly, each lineage has ancestors that are unique to that lineage and ancestors that are shared.
So, do you just not have anything to say about all that? No challenges? Speciation is okay? Phylogenies trace the history of speciation? You're letting that bear talk for quite a bit without interjecting. Does your silence mean we can agree on what the bear is saying?
Our friends over at Berkeley are like children exploring a forest.
Guess not.
They can see that branches meet at limbs, and limbs meet at the trunk. So they say, "Golly, maybe all these tree trunks are just branches on an even bigger tree, way underground. Maybe this whole forest is only one big tree." It's creative, but if you start digging, you'll find a significant lack of evidence for their theory.
Unless you happen to be digging in the Pando Forest, which is an entire colony of a single aspen tree, all connected underground by the roots. So if you dig there, then that is exactly what you find. But here we suffer more from the breakdown of the analogy rather than the breakdown of science. All analogies are necessarily imperfect. If an analogy were perfect, it would cease to be an analogy and would just be the same as whatever it was supposed to have been analogous to. For instance, if I say that sleeping on my bed is like sleeping on a pile of feathers, it could well be that my bed feels quite similar to being on actual feathers, but there will be differences. Unless my bed is a pile of feathers, which would then make it a perfect analogy, except that in its perfection it has ceased to be a comparison and has just become a statement of fact. What I'm trying to say is, if you take an analogy further than it was ever meant to go, of course it will break down. But even in this case, it could be said that the tree is all life on planet Earth, while the forest would be life in the rest of the universe. They have all most likely evolved through what we know as Darwinian evolution, but they would not be related to us, and as such would have no place on our family tree. So there, you take a good analogy, take it too far, and so make it a bad analogy, and now I've fixed it for you again. You're really good at ruining analogies.
Grab your shovels, kids. We're going to take a look into the roots of the problem. Once again, none of this is based on observable data or events.
At this point in my series, rather than restate again my list of characteristics that demonstrate why we not only belong to our current branch of the Tree of Life, but also why we belong categorically in every branch that leads up to it, I will simply direct you to the part in this series where I went through it last time. For reference, it's in part 3.
Except at the level where all of the points on the chart are dogs, or where all of the points on the chart are cabbages. When you back out far enough to find where dogs blend with cats and with turtles and with cabbage, there's nothing which actually exists to fill in the chart.
That depends. Are you including the genomes of all of these various animals in your nothing? Because they most certainly do exist. There are entire fields of science that would not only not exist without these genomes, but would not even be remotely possible if evolution were not true. Here's a link to a simplified primer on what comparative genomics is. This is a field that would not be possible without evolution, and there are very real scientific advances that are being made in this field.
This is the result of beginning with an assumption of the evolutionary theory, then putting different species into a faux animation sequence.
Actually, those faux animation sequences are never presented as if that's exactly what happened. They are visually pleasing representations of a bigger picture. That's it. We deduced which animals go where in those sequences through various methods, the most obvious being fossil data. The older organisms tended to be simpler, and eventually led back to the point where they all lived in the water. Go back far enough and you get the vast majority of the history of the Earth, in which dwelt nothing but single-celled organisms for billions of years.
Don't get me wrong, you bring in John Lasseter and add some catchy musical numbers, and this animation sequence can be every bit as good as Oliver and Company. But a fictional story, animated for kids, is still fictional. And to be honest, I didn't really like Oliver and Company.
I don't think that anyone on either side of the debate have ever claimed that something is true because it was animated for children. This whole segment sounds to me like you're just upset that atheists will often refer to religions as groups of fairy tales, and you seem to think that our argument relies on the fact that they're often animated for kids. Well, it doesn't. We call religions fairy tales because they are fantastical tales with no grounds in reality that may or may not teach some moral lesson. They involve things that we know do not happen, like talking snakes and donkeys and global flooding, people rising from the dead, etc. Evolution, on the other hand, has plenty of evidence to back it up, not the least of which is the fossil record, which shows the animals that are often used for these little animation sequences. We can't prove 100% that any of those exact fossils were actually our ancestors, but we know the overall trend that is clearly displayed in the fossil record, so we have a good idea of what it must have looked like.
But I digress. What they failed to show above is how many of those lines should be dotted to indicate no known species exists here, living or in the fossil record.
Yeah, we can't trace our lineage through every single individual species, but there have been so many species in existence over the course of the billions of years our planet has been around, and the hundreds of millions of years that multicellular life has been here, so it's to be expected that not only will the majority of these species never be found, but that the majority of the ones which are found will not be in our direct ancestral line, which makes it all the more amazing that we have as complete a knowledge of our ancestry as we do.
The ape-to-human family tree would be almost entirely dotted lines, and where it isn't, would merely be connecting humans with humans, or apes with apes, which is not something creationists disagree with.
Setting aside for the moment the fact that comparing apes to apes and apes to humans are the exact same thing since we are apes by definition, we do have a fairly complete record of human evolution leading back to early primates 65 million years ago. But here we'll just go through some of the more recent primate evolution, shall we? While we're looking at all these animals, let's keep a human skull up on the left for comparison, and I'm going to be skipping a few steps where we don't have enough data to construct a skull. Now we'll start with one that is clearly not human, the Sahelanthropus chidensis from about 6 million years ago. Definitely not human. Next up, we go to the Ardipithecus ramidus. You can see it is quite clearly still different from the human skull, with a much smaller cranial capacity and a completely different set of teeth, but it's still quite similar to the chidensis skull, with its very pronounced brow ridges. The nasal cavity is also much closer to the chidensis, being sloped back rather than sticking out like the human skull, so not different enough to require macroevolution, I think. At least these two are much closer to each other than a Chihuahua is to a Great Dane, so I think a creationist could be comfortable calling these two the same kind. Next comes the Australopithecus anamensis. It's getting a little closer to the human skull, but the cranial capacity is still much too small. The cheekbones and brow ridges are too pronounced, and the nose is still sloping backwards. The teeth are a little bit closer, but it's still off by a long shot and is very close to the Ardipithecus ramidus. Next we have the Australopithecus afarensis, which, as you can see from the cheekbones, pronounced brow ridges, and the size of the cranium, is still very similar to the anamensis, but the teeth are starting to look quite similar to human teeth. It's still definitely not human, but it's much closer than the chidensis. Now on to the Australopithecus africanus. Here we're starting to see the cranial capacity increase further while the brow ridges and cheekbones continue to diminish. The nose is not sloped back quite as much and the teeth are again close to human, but it is still quite obviously closer to the afarensis than to us. Next comes the Homo rudolfensis. Look at that huge cranium. Is this where you start lumping them in as all different humans? Because this one, while very human-like at first glance, has some very non-human features. Its brow ridges and cheekbones are still too large, and the nose is still sloping slightly backward. And while its cranium is quite large compared to the Australopithecine, it is still far too small to be human, coming in at 775 cc's, human being around 1300 cc's. Also, because of the teeth and its long face, it is still debated whether this one should be part of Australopithecus rather than Homo. Now, putting this one side by side with Australopithecus africanus, you can see that they are still quite similar, yet it is also quite similar to the human skull. Moving on, we have the Homo habilis, which again, side by side with the Rudolfensis, looks very similar, but is also getting closer to the human skull. Its brow ridges and cheekbones are even smaller, and its brain is even bigger, with a shorter face and a nose that is almost flat rather than sloping backward. Next up is Homo erectus, my grade school sense of humor's favorite species name. Again, looking at the cheeks, brows, and nose, this is quite clearly not a human skull, but the teeth and cranium are getting quite close. Not quite there, though. And now we get to Homo heidelbergensis, whose brain size is now up to 1100 cc's. Remember, a human brain is about 1300 cc's. Now we see the nose sloping forward and the cheeks being less pronounced, but the brows are still way too big and the cranium isn't quite up to human capacity yet. So again, not a human, but still very similar to a human and very similar to the step before it. And now finally we reach Homo sapiens. Very similar to the last step, but quite clearly a different species. Now you said,
The ape-to-human family tree would be almost entirely dotted lines, and where it isn't, would merely be connecting humans with humans, or apes with apes.
even including the fact that I skipped several steps because we don't have the skulls for those species, I showed a line of skulls that all look very similar to the ones before and after in the lineup. So similar that I don't think creationists would call them different kinds. But at the end of the line was a human skull, and at the beginning of the line was a clearly non-human primate. So my challenge to anyone who may wish to respond to me is this. Tell me at which point in this skull lineup did it stop being ape and start being human? I can guarantee that if you pick any skull other than the human one, I can show you enough significant differences between the human skull and whichever one you pick to demonstrate that it is indisputably not a human.
We're all just fine with the idea of apes giving birth to apes and humans giving birth to humans.
Same thing. An ape is simply a large primate that lacks a tail, which we are. As for primate, if you want to dispute that one, then just remember that primates are simply mammals that have hands, hand-like feet, and forward-facing eyes. So yeah, by definition, we are apes, even if you don't accept evolution.
So where there is actually some evidence to look at, we tend to agree with the Understanding Evolution team. What we disagree with is all of the places where they draw a line from, for example, cabbages to wolves, when the existence of the cabbage wolf is, as of yet, without hard evidence.
Your cabbage wolf diagram was slightly amusing the first time you showed it. Now it's getting more than a bit old. Interesting, though, that you showed the whole wolf to modern-day dog diagram and said you agree with it. Now, if you go back to the skull section of this video, you will recall that a Chihuahua's skull is very much different than that of a Great Dane. I would say that the differences are more pronounced than those between a human and the Sahelanthropus chidensis. So you agree that the Chihuahua and Great Dane share a common ancestor, but for some reason it's impossible for you to agree that a human and a chimpanzee also share a common ancestor, when we are at least as close to chimps morphologically as a Chihuahua is to a Great Dane, if not closer.
Building the tree.
Whoa there, buddy. Back it up a bit. You just skipped 2 entire pages of the Berkeley website, Understanding Phylogenies 2 of 2, and Trees, Not Ladders. And you didn't mention it like you said you would here.
The site I am reviewing is called Evolution 101, and will be presented by me with no editing, though plenty of editorials. And in those few places where parts were cut out for brevity, I make note of it being done.
It is possible that these pages were put up after you made your video, but I'm done giving you the benefit of the doubt, so at this point I'm just going to assume dishonesty on your part, okay?
Like family trees, phylogenetic trees represent patterns of ancestry.
Remember above where they admitted that the ancestry was hypothetical guesswork? I just wanted to remind you, as it seems they have already forgotten.
Well, then allow me to remind you that every phylogeny is hypothetical based solely on the fact that none of them will contain every organism to ever have lived, and the Berkeley team was simply being intellectually honest about it.
However, while families have the opportunity to record their own history as it happens, evolutionary lineages do not. Species in nature do not come with pieces of paper showing their family histories.
Shocking as this will be to people like Richard Dawkins, we creationists already knew this before Berkeley put it on the internet.
You didn't have a monopoly on bad jokes last time I checked, and that was funnier than a lot of yours anyways.
Instead, biologists must reconstruct those histories by collecting and analyzing evidence, which they use to form a hypothesis about how the organisms are related, a phylogeny.
Let me translate with my handy Darwin to English dictionary.
And let me translate you. Every time you say something like that, what you seem to mean is, let me grossly oversimplify what they are saying and add in a bunch of my own opinions to make it sound ridiculous and unscientific despite the fact that there is a plethora of scientific evidence for it.
We don't see things evolve, we can't observe evolution, making it no longer observational science, so we invent it as we go along. Charts like this are speculative guesswork based on our faith.
I wish I hadn't seen that coming. You can say things as incredulously as you like, but your personal incredulity does not change the facts. These phylogenetic charts are not speculative. They are based on mountains of evidence from multiple fields of science like embryology and comparative genomics.
I'm paraphrasing, but nothing I am saying contradicts what they are saying.
How do you figure? That directly contradicted it. I mean, not once did they say anything about taking things on faith. In fact, they specifically said that they collect and analyze evidence which is then used to form hypotheses about how organisms are related. How is that not contradicted by...
So we invent it as we go along. Charts like this are speculative guesswork based on our faith.
You clearly don't understand what a contradiction is, which actually might explain how you can think that the Bible is inerrant.
I'm literally just clarifying.
To build a phylogenetic tree such as the one above, biologists collect data about the characters of each organism they're interested in. Characters are heritable traits that can be compared across organisms, such as physical characteristics, morphology, genetic sequences, and behavioral traits.
I did this once, and made a chart showing that all of life on Earth had evolved from rabbits. To be honest, mine made a lot more sense than some of these. For instance, mine explained the origin of the platypus. It involved a migrating space duck. I'll publish that someday.
I once made a chart based on my whimsical fancies, therefore the study of phylogeny is bunk. Nice quality arguments you're bringing to the table.
In order to construct the vertebrate phylogeny, we begin by examining representatives of each lineage to learn about their basic morphology, whether or not the lineage has vertebrae, a bony skeleton, 4 limbs, an amniotic egg, etc.
Or if they have fur, cute noses, long ears, a tendency to nap all day, eat hay, and poop on the floor. Bunny traits, which I think you will find a lot of animals share.
You know what you just did there? You accidentally and sarcastically built a working phylogeny. You know why? Because all the animals that share all of those traits will be in the mammal category. You just made a little clade there. Congratulations, you just constructed a basic phylogeny, and if my 6-year-old made that, I would be really proud of him for it.
Using shared derived characters. Our goal is to find evidence that will help us group organisms into less and less inclusive clades. Specifically, we are interested in shared derived characters. A shared character is one that 2 lineages have in common, and a derived character is one that evolved in the lineage leading up to a clade and that sets members of that clade apart from other individuals.
For instance, cabbage are green, and frogs are green, so we can group frogs with cabbages.
Not quite. You see, there are ways of telling when things evolved independently of each other, also known as convergent evolution. Frogs and cabbages are both green for very different reasons. For frogs, it's camouflage, and for cabbages, it's photosynthesis. So we can be reasonably certain that these traits evolved independently of each other. It's not coincidence, though, as frogs usually live in places where there are lots of green photosynthesizing plants around, so a green frog will blend in with the green cabbages better than a blue one would.
The platypus is still on an island somewhere between beaver and duck with question marks around it.
Shared derived characters can be used to group organisms into clades. For example, amphibians, turtles, lizards, snakes, crocodiles, birds and mammals all have, or historically had, 4 limbs. If you look at a modern snake you might not see obvious limbs, but fossils show that ancient snakes did have limbs, and some modern snakes actually do retain rudimentary limbs. 4 limbs is a shared derived character inherited from a common ancestor that helps set apart this particular clade of vertebrates.
I just have to ask, if they find a fossil skeleton of an animal with 4 limbs, why do they think it was a snake? Is it just me? Who looks at what is essentially a gecko or a salamander and says, "This lizard-like skeleton with 4 legs? Snake! Yep, 4-legged snake!"
Well, that's rich, coming from the guy who believes that snakes did used to have legs, and the reason that they no longer do is because God is punishing the snake for tempting Eve with the magic knowledge fruit. Oh, you don't believe that? I thought you took Genesis literally. That's what Genesis says. So if you don't believe that, then you don't take the Genesis creation story literally. And if you don't take the creation story literally, then why do you have such a problem with evolution? Back on topic, here's a picture of a fossil snake with 4 legs. Is that essentially a gecko or a salamander? It bloody well looks like a snake to me.
Yeah, who is that guy, and what university gave him tenure? And it is simply false that snakes have legs. They have a bone structure in the back half of the snake, which, with the right imagination, is located where hind legs would be if snakes had legs.
And all snakes have the genes for making legs, but they don't get switched on at the key time that would cause the legs to grow. Except when they do, in which case you get mutant snakes like this one. Professor Stick did a response to you on that very topic, and he did an excellent job, so I highly recommend checking out his video on that, and not just because he's one of my secret gay lovers. Don't tell my wife.
That bone is used to anchor muscles which are necessary to make baby snakes. So no, snakes do not have legs.
Well, since those bones, namely the pelvis, anchor muscles that are necessary and or helpful for baby making in pretty much all species that have a pelvis, I wouldn't think that the muscles being attached to a snake's vestigial pelvis being necessary for the same thing would be good evidence against evolution. It's actually pretty decent evidence for it, so thanks for that.
And neither do whales. Who's saying that whales have legs? Ho-ho! You just wait! They'll get there!
Yes, we will. But I think right now the question everyone is wondering about is, are you going to get to the evidence you mentioned in your last video about whether or not birds are dinosaurs? You left us on a cliffhanger and didn't even mention it this time. Are you just hoping we forget, or are you bad at planning your videos and it's done much later?
However, the presence of 4 limbs is not useful for determining relationships within the clade in green above, since all lineages in the clade have that character. To determine the relationships in that clade, we would need to examine other characters that vary across the lineages in the clade.
Can I just point out that we are still talking about creatively inventing these charts based on not observing anything evolve into anything else?
Yeah, because this is charting relationships. You don't have to observe something evolve in order to observe that it's morphologically and genetically similar to other creatures.
Yeah, it would be easy to forget that amidst all of this chart business. For instance, that all land-dwelling animals evolved from the same 4-legged ancestor is merely assumed. No evidence is provided for it, and I seriously doubt they would even claim that any exists.
Comparative genomics and embryology have quite a bit of evidence for that particular event. You had gill slits at one point in your development. Why would God specially create you with a feature from a fish, and then turn that feature into face muscles and ear bones? Well, that's it for this one. Remember to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time!